When countries in the global south gained independence from European colonial rule, they didn't fully break away from the systems imposed by their former colonizers. While they became independent nations, they continued to follow the same ideas about borders, governance, and state power, ideas shaped by colonial rule. In other words, they removed foreign rulers, but they didn't necessarily rethink the structures that define nations and states. In today's episode, we explore how the Indian and Kashmiri governments used development and governance to tighten India's control over Kashmir after partition. Our guest today is Hafsa Kanjwal, author of the book Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation. In her book, she argues that India's efforts to integrate and develop Kashmir after British rule was fundamentally colonial. She examines how India brought Kashmir under its control without the people's approval, using local leaders who followed India's interests. Her work argues that India's actions were not about freedom, but instead shows them as part of a larger effort to strengthen the country after World War II. If you're enjoying the Brown History Podcast, the Instagram feed, the newsletter, do help out. You can be a patron. You can be a subscriber to our newsletter. You can check out the Brown History Shop. There's so many ways to help out, and it really, really goes a long way. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get this started. Thank you for coming on and talking about this. It's a very important issue, very controversial. The title of this book is Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation. And I guess my first question would be that, these days when people think of Kashmir, I know the word occupation ties in with Kashmir a lot, but at the same time, a lot of people on Instagram, on social media, see Kashmir through the eyes of celebrities and rich people going on vacation and showing this kind of different side to it. So I wanted to know, what is the contrast between what's going on really on the ground and what's being shown from the elite class? And I think you have personal ties to Kashmir. I think you're from there and your family is there. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I also wanted to know what does daily life look like for Kashmir, and how does that differ from the polished portrayals that we see online?
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a great question to start with, I guess, because it gets us to thinking about what is being perceived, right? And oftentimes, what is being perceived about Kashmir is a very clear and intentional, manipulated message or propaganda about what's actually happening there. And yet, people's day-to-day lives are incredibly difficult. And so I'll kind of maybe give you a little bit of background. I am from Kashmir. I was born in Srinagar. My family left in the early 90s, during the time of heightened militarization and during the massive human rights violations that were happening. And today, if you kind of see Kashmir from the outside, meaning you're just going on Instagram, there is a narrative that's being pushed out that things are quote unquote normal, and that since 2019, the Indian government has basically gotten rid of the problem, the insurgency, or the Pakistan-based groups that exist in Kashmir, and that Kashmiris are fine and they're flourishing under India's new rule. And that's basically the narrative that you are getting in these posts. And
Mm-hmm.
it's supported by a lot of people who are visiting Kashmir. Very recently, a very popular Punjabi singer, Diljit Dosanjh, went
Yeah.
to Kashmir, and it was a pretty controversial visit, right? Because on the one hand, people who are not as critical saw him as trying to kind of make an attempt to kind of incorporate Kashmir and its multi-religious traditions, where the fit in, right? And on the other hand, and especially because he's seen as someone who kind of has anti-Modi or anti-Hindutva politics. And yet, on the other hand, for many Kashmiris, it was attempt to show the kind of normalcy, perhaps in this way, not through a Hindu nationalist frame, but someone who's actually kind of widely liked or respected, especially because of his activism during the farmers' protests. It was an attempt to kind of use a figure like him to basically lay this claim to Kashmir again. If you saw one of the earlier videos that he posted, he's showing like the religious sites, he's showing the nature, he's wearing a fit-in, but it's very clear he just writes like Kashmir and then you have the Indian flag. He's letting you know like this is what, this is the message that you're trying to get across. For people that I know who are in Kashmir, life has become extremely difficult in the past 5 or so years. Of course, has been for a long time. But many of my friends and people that I know are have really been forced to self-censor because the stakes for speaking out against the government or India's settler colonization of the region right now that's happening at a very rapid pace. The stakes for saying anything about that right now are very, very high. People are being removed from their jobs. They're not being hired. They are not being allowed to travel. Many of my friends have had their passports suspended because of the work that they've done in the past,
Mm-hmm.
not even at present. And so that's the reality that not a lot of people are talking about, the immense repression that's existing there right now, where, anything you say could get you or your family members in significant trouble. And that is precisely the kind of repression that these propaganda narratives that you see completely all over social media are trying to kind of repress.
Let's start from the beginning. Let's go back to the origin story. Your book kind of only focuses like on the first half and doesn't go to like when they in the 80s and the 90s, it doesn't really go there. But I guess you're trying to unpack the colonial narratives and maybe trying to unpack that and trying to I guess I mean it's so hard not to look at Palestine and Israel and use that as a framework I know all occupations and all situations are different and unique on their own, but I guess most people listening in are going to use that as the comparison to understand the framework that's going on here. So I think it's very important to go back to the origins and see how this all started. So I was gonna say, let me start. Let me try to explain it, but I think that's going to be too difficult. So maybe you want to give it a go.
Sure.
Or okay, you know what? Let me try. Let me try and then you can just kind of correct me and fix it up because it'll be
Okay,
very simplified, but maybe that's better for people to understand and then kind of advance it to the more complicated situation.
sure.
Once upon a time, there was a Maharaja. There was a lot of kingdoms all around India, and before partition. And when partition came, these kingdoms had to choose between acceding to Pakistan or going into India. And in this situation, Kashmir was ruled by a Hindu Maharaja, a Hindu king, and the majority was Muslims, and he was not liked by the Muslim population. And he was not liked. And I don't know if that gives a king the right to decide the fate of a people who don't like him, who is not liked by them. So that's another discussion. And so he is very brutal towards his people, his Muslim majority, and they rebel. But at the same time, there's another bunch of people coming from what is now Pakistan. There's some tribal from the tribes, there's fighters coming in, and then that scares him, and then he decides to switch to India. That's it for now. I mean,
Okay.
let's just stop there and tell me what I'm missing here.
Okay. That's not a terrible start. So I guess we can, it's hard to come up with origin stories, right? Because um how far back do you want to go in Kashmir's history
True, true.
when it was its own independent kingdom, when it was ruled by the Mughals, the Sikhs, and then the group that you're referring to, the rulers that you're referring to are the Dogras, right? These are the princely rulers. But for our kind of intents and purposes, I guess, to simplify things, we can start with the mid 1800s, because I would say that begins the modern history of Kashmir. Uh,
Hmm.
but what I want to say is that a lot of people do begin this history in 1947 with exactly the kind of processes that you describe, where there's this, partition happens, the king has to choose. And I would say that is a very selective reading of history that primarily prioritizes the narratives or the nationalist narratives of both India and Pakistan, right? That see Kashmir or view Kashmir strictly as this dispute. And so you start the history at the time when it becomes a dispute.
Right.
I would go back a bit farther in the mid 1800s when basically you gave the example of Palestine and some of the interesting similarities. And of course, again, like you mentioned, they're not the same, but I would say there's some interesting parallels where you have British colonial rule really defining how events in this region are shaped in the more modern period. So as the British are expanding across the subcontinent. They are looking at places like Punjab and Kashmir. They get into a war with the Sikh Empire. At that time, Kashmir was a part of the Sikh Empire. And finally, they're assisted by this Hindu Dogra warlord named Gulab Singh, who they basically promise Kashmir to if he assists them in their fight against the Sikh Empire. And so once that battle happens in 1846, something called the Treaty of Amritsar is signed, and the British colonial government basically grants this region to the Dogras, and then they also expand their territories, which basically would culminate into what's called the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned, there were over 560, 580 princely states. These were kingdoms that were given some level of autonomy, but still relatively significant, like a watch from the British Empire.
Yeah.
Kashmir was really important, and it was really significant for multiple colonial powers. For the British, it was really important because it was at the border with the Russian Empire, right? And so they were worried. They really needed to keep track of what was happening in Kashmir because of they were worried of Tsarist influence. Um, and subsequently, for both the post-colonial nation states, it becomes really important as well, just because of its where it's located geographically, but also its natural resources and kind of the narratives and the discourses that are being told about this place already in the colonial period. So, like you mentioned, the Dogras were not well liked by a vast majority of the population, which was Muslim. There were also significant Kashmiri Pandit and some Sikh and Buddhist populations as well across the entire territory of Jammu and the Jammu and Kashmir princely state. But the Dogras basically saw Kashmiri Muslims in particular as people that they could rule over and extract labor and resources
Mm-hmm.
from. And so most of Kashmir's majority Muslim population were peasants. They were agriculturalists, farmers, extremely poor for many decades, even up until 1941, which is just a few years before partition. Less than 2% of the Kashmiri Muslim population was even what you would call literate, right? So this is a population that has been heavily suppressed. Um, and so starting in the 19, I mean, as early as in the 1800s, but especially in the 1920s and 1930s, they are starting to mobilize. And those of them who have gotten educated, left the Kashmir state, went to school in Lahore or in Aligarh, and then they start this movement that's basically an anti-monarchical movement. And
Right.
as with many movements, it has kind of different fissures, right? And different perspectives on how to move things forward. And so you have people like Sheikh Abdullah, who was very popular during this time for his speaking out and his activism against the Dogras. And then you have other people who aren't talked about because oftentimes the history only speaks about Sheikh Abdullah and one kind of very particular narrative of how this Kashmiri leader went and joined India, right? And acceded to India. And so that means that Kashmir should have been a part of India, and that's what the people wanted. But that was absolutely not the case. But the agitation against the Dogras is happening both in the Kashmir Valley, but it's also happening in other parts of the princely state, including places like Jammu and Poonch. And what a lot of people don't know is that this region was actually at that time majority Muslim. It's because of what historians have called the Jammu massacre, which happened in 1947. Um, it's because of the Maharaja basically violently suppressing a rebellion in these regions against his rule, that there is an actual demographic shift. Historians say that up to 250,000 people were killed during this massacre that happened in this region, and another 250,000 or more were displaced in what became Azad Kashmir, and then also, of course, in Pakistan as well. And so this massacre is really important to the kind of thinking through like how, at least in 1947, the events transpired, because part of what has happened is that Indian discourses, but also Kashmiri discourses led by National Conference, which Sheikh Abdullah led, have completely kind of tried to erase the memory of this massacre because they're trying to paint Kashmir as a place that um, didn't have this kind of religious tension, as is what happened in other parts of the subcontinent. But they're also trying to justify the fact that the Maharaja Hari Singh, who you mentioned, would have acceded to India, right? So if you then say that this Maharaja has committed this massive massacre, then what right does he have? Like as you mentioned, what
Yeah,
justification is there for him to
yeah.
make such a huge and significant decision for the people of his state. And so what then does get focused on is the tribal raid, what's called the tribal raid that you mentioned. Um,
Yeah.
so what's important to know about that is there's a couple of things.
The
One,
story, the story goes is that India saves the people from a tribal invasion. Is that
yes,
right?
that's sponsored by Pakistan. So that's important, right? Is say that these tribals are actually like working on behalf of the Pakistani state, and this is like all Pakistan's doing. Um, but there's a couple of, couple of nuances to obviously that story or that narrative. One is that you can't understand this tribal raid without understanding the Jammu massacre and also the massacres in Poonch. Because it's important to know that during this time, the people of the Jammu and Kashmir princely state had really close ties with the people of what is now northwest Pakistan, and then also parts of Punjab, which became part of Pakistan as well. Because for so many, for much of the year, the land route that would connect Indian mainland with the Kashmir Valley was actually not operable because of heavy snow. So a lot of the trade, a lot of the economic ties, family ties, educational ties that many Kashmiris in that time period, especially Kashmiri Muslims, would have been with what became Pakistan. And so once this rebellion against the Maharaja begins in Jammu and in Poonch, and the Maharaja again suppresses it immensely, people in these regions come to hear of the fact that there is this massacre happening against Muslims in Kashmir. And so that's where this sort of tribal, quote unquote, tribals organize. These are people from the Northwest province at that time. And again, in terms of their intentions, I mean, from what I can understand, by hearing these different narratives, is that although it's very likely that some aspects of the Pakistani state, as it's just kind of coming into being itself, because again, this is just a few months after independence in October, um, as some members may have assisted the tribal by giving them, weapons or transportation, they really felt that it was a religious obligation to stand against the Maharaja and his policies in against their fellow Muslim brethren in Kashmir. I mean, I think that was their primary motive. But again, the story is depicted in a way so as to paint it as an invasion by Pakistan and not a response to the Jammu massacre by the Maharaja, which the Indian state, by the way, and different groups within India are also complicit in, because part of what we're also coming to find is that our members of the RSS or RSS kind of affiliated organizations and also state forces from other places like Patiala were assisting the Maharaja in this massacre against Jammu's Muslims. And so India, the government of Nehru's government, kind of completely tries to put this under the rug. And it's precisely because their claim to Kashmir lies on this fact that as the Maharaja was escaping Srinagar, going to Jammu, he signed this treaty that would allow Indian military aid to come to Kashmir's assistance against the tribals. Um, and so the kind of the story is that India made him sign this treaty before it would send its military assistance. But what's interesting is that even within the treaty itself, and a lot of people don't talk about this, is that even though he quote unquote did this accession with the Indian Union, it was still respect to a final decision that was to come, from the people themselves. So it wasn't final. By no means was even the initial instrument of accession, whether or not you would, I personally would not hold it as legally viable, primarily also because it was signed by someone who had just committed a massacre. But even if you don't consider, I mean, if you want to kind of see it as this legal document, even
Yeah.
within its implementation, it's supposed to be until there's a final kind of resolution by the people themselves.
So how does India play into this? This was a time when India was the colonized and now becomes free, and now they have this relationship with Kashmir where they're trying to, I mean, they would say trying to bring it aboard. You would say colonizing. Now, and Nehru himself is considered a hero, the mascot of the world anti-colonial movement that's being held. And there are a lot of things that I've seen debaters who are, from Kashmir quote things that Nehru say for the Kashmir people in favor of the Kashmir people. But at the same time, I've read quotes in here that you would say says the opposite, says things that are going against the image that he has right now.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I want to actually talk a little bit about to answer your question because you asked what role does India play in this, and what I wanted to say, give you a bit of context about is what role Brahmanism actually and upper caste ideologies play in this,
Okay.
because
This
part of
this is during the 1947 we're talking about, right?
it's
Not
during
now.
nine. Yeah, not no, no, definitely
Back
not
then.
now.
Back
Yeah,
then.
yeah.
Back then. Okay.
This is even back then. So when part of what the British kind of attempt to legitimize their presence in the subcontinent, but also in the case of Kashmir, Dogra rulers, right? Because Dogras are from the region of Jammu. They have no ties, like they have no direct political ties with Kashmir. They're not from there. They were in effect foreign, quote unquote, foreign rulers within the Kashmir Valley itself. But
Okay.
what the British do is they have to figure out a way to legitimize Dogra rule and specifically then Hindu rule in Kashmir. And so much as what happened with, across the subcontinent, British Orientalists, British scholars, British officials worked with upper caste Hindu Brahmins to construct a narrative about the subcontinent's past that aligned with these upper caste Brahmanical historical narratives. And the narrative is very straightforward that Hindus are indigenous to this land. And then, in the case of Kashmir, is that Hindus were the original inhabitants of Kashmir. They were wiped out by incoming like Muslim invaders from Central Asia. And so us claiming this land back, both in the context of the subcontinent at large, but also, of course, then Kashmir is part of kind of this, recovery of what was once ours. So that's the narrative. It exists across the subcontinent, but it also exists in Kashmir. And so for many Indians, whether they were kind of Hindu nationalist in terms of their vision, but also upper caste, right? And that kind of also included members of the Indian National Congress, including Nehru. They saw Kashmir as very integral to this idea of a Hindu homeland. And it was precisely because of the claims they were making about who was and wasn't indigenous to Kashmir. And so I think that ideology is really important to understand because more also than just kind of the attempt to have Kashmir because of its geopolitical significance or because of its, natural resources. It's also this kind of ideological claim to the land is um, that is part of this Brahmanical imaginary of the subcontinent. So I think that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. And so Nehru itself, he's very interesting because he is also Kashmiri Brahmin. His family had moved out of the valley many centuries prior. And so he has this like fascination, I would say obsession in many ways, with Kashmir. I talk in my book, as you mentioned, about, the way in which he genders Kashmir as like this beautiful, exquisite woman that he wants to claim. And then there's also things he has to say about Kashmiris, like not being very valiant or virile, and that basically all they cared about was a good meal. Like they just were hungry and we just needed to feed them. So when I looked at Nehru's narratives about Kashmir, it was no different from how many European or British people would talk about the lands that they were colonizing, right? They would kind of create this this mystique around the place. They would talk about the beauty of the place, but then they would deride the inhabitants of that place. And Nehru was doing precisely that, which the British had done before him. And so to me, that felt like a very kind of like clear kind of gaze that Nehru had as now this leader of this independent nation state that wanted to claim Kashmir based on this idea that this was originally Hindu land. Um, so that's why he's able to say these things. And he does make promises to the people where he uh, says that, this is not final, you will have your choice, you will vote. Up until I think around 1950 or so, he's making the promises of a plebiscite. And then eventually it's very clear that he had not intended that all along, and it was basically using a lot of other excuses to justify this narrative that India did not need to be accountable to a plebiscite anymore.
So let's jump to the plebiscite. That's a for people who don't know, it's kind of like a vote. So what happens first? India and Pakistan go to war, and then Nehru puts Sheikh Abdullah in charge, or it's the
Hmm.
other way around. And
It's
then and then how do we get to this point where the United Nations gets involved?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. So after the Maharaja signs this Treaty of Accession, the Indian Army comes in October 1947, late October 1947. And then Pakistan also sends its formal army as well, and the two go to war. And then it's in early 1948 that India actually takes the issue to the United Nations, thinking that the UN will rule in its favor immediately and declare Pakistan as the aggressor. But the UN doesn't do that. It calls for a series of meetings. It's one of the main issues that were discussed at the UN alongside what was happening with Palestine. And UN members at that time basically call for a plebiscite or referendum, a vote to be held between India and Pakistan. And this isn't anything shocking. Plebiscites or referendums were a way for powers in this moment of decolonization to figure out like what people's self-determination was, right? That was one mechanism of figuring out what self-determination is. What's important to know about the vote is that it only allowed for two options, though, India and Pakistan. And while some people have argued that there were sentiments that Kashmiris would have wanted to have their own independence, even a figure like Sheikh Abdullah would have possibly preferred independence, um, those sentiments were not seen as valid by both the imperial powers, but also the two new nation states, who, all for their different interests, wanted Kashmir to be part of either of the two states. So that's one thing that's important.
Sorry,
Um,
so just to
yeah.
clarify, the referendum, the vote only has two options. Like they couldn't, there's no third option where they are their own people, their own self-determined people. There's
Yes.
only two
Yeah.
options.
Just
And
two
okay,
options.
so it's you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
Well, a lot of Kashmiris would have perhaps
At
not
that
seen it that way
time,
at that time because many of them would have wanted to join Pakistan, right? So there
right.
that also
Okay,
was
so
an
I
contingent.
guess the concept of being your own state comes later on.
So this is where, I mean, I think it comes later on in terms of like a broader perception, starting as early as the 1970s. But this has been one of the kind of main fissures, you could say, within this movement for self-determination is that
Right.
on the one hand, there are a lot of Kashmiris who support Kashmir's merger with Pakistan, including those who then, ended up liberating the land, which is now called Azad Kashmir. Even the people of Gilgit-Baltistan initially sought a relationship with the Pakistan state as well. And then there were many within, the region that was ethnically cleansed, and then also within the Kashmir Valley that would have supported that. But then there were others who really felt that having like a and this kind of came more later, was that Kashmir was kind of had this distinct history, right? So all sorts of nationalisms create their own kind of origin stories too, that Kashmir was an independent kingdom for many centuries, and that the people had this kind of strong identity, culture, language, etc. And that, being independent would be better for them.
Hmm.
And especially because many of the kind of original theorists who were calling for independence, people like Maqbul Butt and Amanullah Khan, spent time in Pakistan, and were disillusioned with the kinds of things that were happening with the Pakistan state. They held hope in it. They felt that they wanted it to do well, and they wanted it to support the Kashmir liberation struggle. But then they were also disappointed by some of the actions of the Pakistani establishment. And so they felt that, it is important actually to be able to have that sovereignty of your own, and not rely on others. So that's where you kind of get these fissures. But many still believe that Pakistan has a really important role to play because Kashmiris can't take on the Indian state obviously on their own. And Pakistan has
Yeah.
historically been the only, at least on paper, calls for self-determination, which is really important. No other, political power, political state or no other authority has done that. So yeah, I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of that
Yeah. Yeah.
context.
So before that, we were talking about how there's a vote. Nehru is delaying it,
Hmm.
and he puts Sheikh Abdullah in charge. And there's no vote that happens. And India promises Sheikh Abdullah and Kashmir that like they can do their own thing. They can have their own flag. They can um they can keep their properties, and they can be ruled by their own government within Kashmir. So there's a Kashmir government and there's an Indian government. So what is a relationship like that between these two governments, and does one own the other? Is one kind of like working behind and telling what the other to do, or is there a lot of conflict between each other? So how does this weird kind of dynamic work?
Yeah, that's a good
Correct
question.
me if I'm wrong in
No,
any.
it's okay.
Okay.
You got a lot of it right. Uh, so what you're probably basically talking about is this Article 370.
Yes.
Because after the plebiscite, right, it's called for the Nehru government install Sheikh Abdullah in power. Sheikh Abdullah wa was basically in favor of the accession because he believed that Nehru would allow him to run Kashmir as he wanted to, and he was worried that that would not be the possibility in Pakistan.
And they
Um,
were friends.
and they were friends, and they were very close friends. Um, so the idea was that Kashmir's kind of just its communications, foreign affairs, and defense would be with the Indian government, and everything else would be within the purview of the J&K state. And so on paper, it actually looked like this is an interesting experiment in kind of a new political formation in this moment when, you have these different countries and they're all centralizing power. But on practice, it was not that simple. One reason is that a lot of scholars have argued that Nehru saw Article 370 not as a permanent arrangement, but basically as a temporary stopgap measure until the quote unquote nonsense around plebiscite would fade, and then India could basically fully entrench its rule in Kashmir. And so, even from the get-go, Nehru and the Indian government was not serious about autonomy because the plan was that they would eventually get Kashmir completely. But right now, they needed Sheikh Abdullah's support because Sheikh Abdullah had his own intentions in having this autonomous state. They needed his support for the accession, and so they kind of gave him that like here, you can have this. But even within Sheikh Abdullah's rule, he's ousted out of power in 1953. India begins to erode this article already. So they're already kind of going beyond their mandate of communications, defense, foreign affairs. They're trying to intervene in Kashmir's economic matters and its judicial matters and so on and so forth. Sheikh Abdullah also finds it difficult to actually raise funds for the kinds of projects he wants to do because he is not interested in taking money from the Indian government. And
Hmm.
so um, the economic conditions under his rule actually suffer, right? And so the Indian government basically decides that Sheikh Abdullah was becoming too uncooperative. He was giving a series of incendiary speeches that the accession was not final and that Kashmiris were still subject to a plebiscite. And so they use his second in command, someone by the name of Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad, to come to power. And so my book is basically about Bakshi's 10 years in power after Sheikh Abdullah is deposed and arrested, where Bakshi is now this very kind of pragmatic figure who is tasked with um, confirming or fully affirming and institutionalizing this Article 370 and institution and affirming the Kashmir's accession to India. And so that's the role that he plays. He is broadly trying to do that. But basically, what I'm interested in is looking at how he, as a kind of client politician in Kashmir, is also negotiating this relationship with India to for his own objectives, for his own political goals and objectives, but is also using what I call the politics of life to basically fully entrench India's role in Kashmir. And when you said like, does one rule one or the other? I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, um, the Indian government is very kind of obviously the one with greater power, greater authority. But what's interesting is that during Bakshi's time, one of the things that I looked at is how, in some ways, he was able to use the fact that Kashmir was a disputed territory and that people there may want to join Pakistan. He was able to use that to get certain concessions from the Indian government. And one example that I had of this was something like rice, where he basically managed to get a lot of rice subsidies from the Indian government to Kashmir, and he said if they have to pay high prices for rice, they're going to revolt. They might then turn to Pakistan. So he was able to kind of leverage that political instability in the state to get a lot of money flowing into the state. But I also look at what that ultimately led to. One was that it created kind of this political elite, like a collaborator or like a comprador class that was then materially invested in the occupation as well. And this happens across all colonial contexts. It's not, just as in Kashmir, it happens in other places as well. But two, he also kind of creates this dependence then between India and the Kashmir state, which again contributes to the eroding of this autonomy.
So you're basically saying is the man had his own goals, and Ghulam Bakshi had his own goals, and he took advantage of the situation and used India, got money from them, used it to build things, to provide food for the people, and for other maybe for his own benefits.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
definitely for his own
for
benefit.
benefits, yeah. I think he was corrupt. He was very, very corrupted.
Yeah.
So, okay, so just so people know, he was very corrupted. Okay, so I'm trying to understand is that, right, the title of the book is State Building Under Indian Occupation, and under Bakshi, you talk a lot about the word state building.
Hmm.
How does state building fit into colonization? State building, some people, if I were not to read the book and I see state building just on its own, I would assume state building would be like somebody building up a state, building schools, building hospitals. That to me, that's a good thing. That's great. But in this complicated structure we have here, Ghulam Bakshi takes money from India. India, I guess, expects, this is a favor, not like a free thing. And the Kashmir people, okay, so it's such a weird layered thing I'm trying to unpack.
Yeah.
So
I think you're probably trying to understand like how you're
how is
probably,
it bad?
yeah, how is it
How is
bad?
it bad?
Mary
And,
seems
and how's it
you're
bad
getting a
in
good
the
deal out
in
of this.
yeah, you're getting a great deal.
Yeah.
You're making money, hospitals are being built, the people are happy. India, I guess, is if anything, India is the victim. They're giving away money thinking that there's a chance that these people would want to
Yeah.
join them. So they're getting ripped off. Yeah, so try to explain to me how this is bad and this is a form of colonization.
Okay, that's a great question. Yeah, so this is something that I obviously get is, well, it looks like there's this period of normalcy. People seem to be doing well. Like what's wrong with this? But one is that there's no political space that's available to Kashmiris. And so that kind of gets to this broader question of can you really have like sovereignty in other forms of your life? If you don't have any political sovereignty. And Kashmiris at this time did not have political sovereignty. They were promised a plebiscite and they were not able to, that was never fulfilled. And then they were also kind of given these local elections for the local legislative assembly, but it was already kind of rigged again in favor of those parties that were in favor of India. And it didn't allow anyone who was against the accession to join or to run. So one is that under Sheikh Abdullah, under Bakshi, all the way to the present, there is a state of emergency, basically, permanent, almost like a permanent sense of political repression that is upholding this area, right?
Right.
There are dissidents who are arrested. There are people who are tortured, even in this time in the 50s and 60s. That and you mentioned earlier about this question about militarization. Militarization still existed, especially in the border regions, but I mean the Indian Army. At this time, a lot of the torture and the repression and kind of the police tactics, strong arming people was done by Bakshi's people, Bakshi's own men, and like people that he formed the local police force. Um,
Right.
so it was so that, just because there were no army officials, as entrenched as they are today, doesn't mean that there wasn't that kind of political repression. So that's one. One is that that context needs to be talked about. The second is that what actually are Kashmiris getting the benefits in? I mean, in some ways, you may imagine that, the schools that they build were good for people. Of course, it educated people. A lot, like almost a middle class was created in many ways because uh, those students at that time would have gone to medical school, law school, engineering school, etc. So there was this, especially this Muslim Kashmiri middle class that was created or enabled. But in the schools, what's the story that they're learning, right? Like
Mm,
they are learning a
right.
very particular story about Kashmir's past, its relationship with India, what's being erased, right? So there's this attempt to show that Kashmir was always part of India and that there was this like kind of natural teleology that incorporated Kashmir into the Indian state. And so even in these kinds of ways in which the state building occurred, it was to promote very specific emotional and kind of material sentiments in favor of India amongst Kashmiris. So it had a political calculation as well. And for Bakshi, then he was able to use that political calculation to get certain goods for Kashmir. But that's part of my argument in which I try to show that colonial occupations aren't necessarily this top-down process. And sometimes when we talk about them being like intractable or that they're like never going to resolve, um, is 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 precisely because of these contradictions that we see, right? Like with people like the political elites that you mentioned earlier, who were talking about Kashmir as if everything was normal today, to someone like Bakshi and others who become so entrenched in that colonial way of life um, that they themselves are not able to kind of to get out of it. So I think that is important. Like because those people exist doesn't mean that colonialism is not what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But India is really using and these kind of different state building measures to rule Kashmir materially and also symbolically, because part of what I look at in the book is films and tourism and how even like building the tourist infrastructure in Kashmir is in favor of trying to create a desire amongst middle class Indians to lay these claims over Kashmir, right? So even tourism is integrally linked to this colonial project, even though you might just think like, well, it's great, like people are able to visit the region, but what are the things they see? What are the stories they're told about the place and the people and who belongs and who doesn't belong? That's also really important in terms of thinking through what exactly happened with this state building project.
So as the state building is happening, what is happening to the Kashmiris? Like, right, if you wanna take over this land and you want to get these people on your side, the obstacle that I see is culture, history, language, traditions, and you have to get rid of that. You need to clout that and delete that. How did they deal with that when they were state
Yeah,
building? And
that's
does
a
that stay preserved or are they trying to erase it? I guess they are trying to erase it.
well, they're erasing specific things, but I think part of why your question is actually really important is that it gets to this idea also like linked to the politics of life, where um, you know, India saw itself as this country at that time. This is different in some sense today, but as this country that was like unified in diversity, right? So it really wanted to promote its secular credentials and the fact that Kashmir had quote unquote joined India as a Muslim majority region was a way for the Indian state to like just kind of boast about its secular credentials. And so what's interesting about that is that they saw expressions of Kashmiri nationality as being fine, as long as it did not get one too Muslim, right? Or lean towards, seeking alternate political arrangements. And so at this time, I mean, right now with the Hindu Nationalist Project, it's kind of a thing of elimination and erasure. There's a different kind of erasure that's happening here, but there's also a lot of appropriation and incorporation. So part of what I look at is how settler colonial regimes, they don't just rule sometimes by just erasing, getting rid of everything, or erasing those cultural markers. They try to appropriate it sometimes too, and make it as part of their own, right? And then the things
Right.
that they don't like in that culture, they will erase that altogether. And I think we see this in the context of Israel as well, in terms of the
Yeah, the
markers.
food.
Exactly, absolutely. So, Kashmiri cuisine and Kashmiri handicrafts and all of this can be part of, India's kind of multicultural fabric. But if Kashmiris start to have alternate political aspirations or have a different political vision, then that is completely not acceptable, right? So yeah, so I think part of what's important to see about that is appropriation is also a tool that these colonial powers can use. They're not always just trying to erase everything, but kind of bring it into line with their own narrative.
So should we see Article 370 as like the wall that's stopping from a takeover, or should we see Article 370 as kind of like a leash that like
Mm.
keeps India holding on to it? And now that 370 is gone, does this mean that now, I guess, in a unfortunate way, Kashmir is now part of India?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Article 370 was a tunnel. So maybe not a leash, but a tunnel because it did, I mean, it was basically it created this link between the Indian government and Kashmir, and the Kashmir state. But I don't think, I mean, the issue like wasn't really Article 370 because Kashmiris were not invested in autonomy, right? Those who are invested in the question of autonomy would have called for Article 370. But most Kashmiris wouldn't even recognize like even something like the Article 370. But what happens though, and this is really important, is that part of what the settler colonial state, in this case India, is able to do is use markers like Article 370 for people to then have very restricted political imaginaries and kind of be forced to just thinking that, okay, maybe this is the best that we can do, and that's what we should hold on to instead of like full liberation and so on and so forth. That's one way to think about it. And what's different now, though, I would say, like, if you're trying to kind of find some of these differences, is that this question of land becomes a lot more important because although India has taken up Kashmir's land and its army, even before 2019, has taken up huge swaths of land, one of the promises that Nehru had made to Abdullah was that Indians, that the autonomy would exist in a way that Indians wouldn't be able to buy land and property in Kashmir because Abdullah and many of the client regimes were afraid of like some kind of demographic shift that would completely happen, right? Because
Hmm.
then Indians from all over could come settle in the region and and so they were worried about that. So they've really, tried to push this idea that the land and the rights about permanent status and who could get jobs in the state, et cetera, were restricted to Kashmiri state subjects. And I think hesitantly Nehru agreed to this because he knew that it would then continue this relationship between the two. But many Hindu nationalists around Nehru, including in the Congress Party, were not in favor of this. But because Kashmir continued to be in dispute, because Pakistan was involved, because there was this UN resolution and the question of plebiscite, and then later Kashmiri resistance itself, shapes events as well. India wasn't able to get rid of this article directly and settle its people. Um, but it did so in, it eroded Kashmir's autonomy in different ways. But
Hmm.
now, for India's Hindu nationalists who are so much more explicit in their claims over Kashmir, and don't even acknowledge that there's a dispute or anything like that, people, it's not even that they would say that Kashmiri Muslims want India, which is what the Indian secularists would say. They would say, who the hell are the Kashmiri Muslims? Why should we care about them, right? And so that's the shift, is that they don't even like consider these people worthy of any kind of say in their lives or in their futures completely. And so they're if they erase or if they get assimilated, I don't think the current kind of Hindu nationalist government cares. But they're certainly taking steps to ensure that the demographics of the place will dramatically transform. Of course, not overnight, but for sure, like in 10, 15, 20 years, the plan is that demographic engineering.
How does Bollywood play into this? I guess it's the same concept, like the same way as tourism plays into this.
Yeah, Bollywood is a really huge perpetrator of this. And a lot of the Indian cinema that I looked at in the 1950s, 1960s, films that I'm sure your parents' generation or your grandparents' generation would have remember. Many Indian films during this time were filmed in Kashmir, and it was considered this kind of beautiful landscape because of its mountains and its lakes, and so actors and actresses would be there. And so when those films would make it to the screen and average Indians of middle class background, class backgrounds, elites, everyone would see this beautiful place and have this, this feeling or the sentiment towards it. Many of them would have been able to visit. Of course, most wouldn't have. But what they're getting from Kashmir is through the cinematic lens. And it's in this lens that you basically show the Kashmir landscape and create a desire for it, but basically erase the fact that it has any Muslim inhabitants. So what was really crazy for me is that despite Kashmir being this Muslim majority region, um, the markers of Muslimness were so absent from these films. And then, of course, as time shifted in the late 1980s or 90s, there were these films that were made about the movement. And so Kashmiri Muslims then become visible, either before their race, but now they become hyper visible. And then they're very visible through these frameworks of militancy and terrorism and these improper national subjects. And so those are films like Mission Kashmir, Fana, and so on. And
Hmm.
now we're in a stage which, I mean, it's like almost like there's so much overload of Kashmir being so visible in terms of Indian films. Again, so many of them either are filmed there or have scenes there or bring it up in like the strangest ways. But not just beyond film, it's just so much in like popular culture. I've noticed a lot of Indian designers are incorporating Kashmiri themes into their designs, into their fashion. There's so much of an emphasis on tourism again, like almost so many pages. I mean, I can't even count tourism pages and videos on YouTube that show Indian bloggers going to Kashmir and so many of their I've watched some of these videos. It's pretty sickening to be honest to watch them, but I've watched a couple and they'll say things that are super, super problematic towards Kashmiris in that they'll either fetishize them, right? They'll talk about like how hot Kashmiri men are, how beautiful Kashmiri women are, or they'll talk about them as like really like backward simpletons, right? So it's this both this colonial like desire, but then also uh, like revulsion, right? Both of them come out towards Kashmiris when it comes to the Indian colonial mindset. And so, a lot of that has also been a parallel across time as well, and not just like a recent phenomenon.
Recently, I watched there was an Oxford Union debate about Kashmir. I don't know if you watched it,
I heard about it.
and the number one talking point in the team that was against Kashmir's self-determination was that if you were to allow it to be independent, there would be so much destruction, so much violence, and economically they wouldn't be able to stand on their own feet. So to wrap this up, what do you have to say in response to that?
I guess I would have to say India must be really economically great for all of its inhabitants and not a violent place towards religious or other minorities for them to have the audacity to say something like that. I mean, it's really outlandish, like to situate a group of people as being incapable of ruling themselves. I mean, That is precisely what the colonial gaze was about, and that's precisely what they exposed in that reasoning. And I no one assumes that like a free Kashmir or Kashmir being independent or being part of Pakistan would solve all of its problems or that it would be like perfect. But the level of indignity that people have been um, subjected to is inexcusable. And and also part of what we have to think about when we think about futures, because I guess part of what your question is asking about futures is where do we not see the kind of violent nationalisms that have erupted all over the world? So many of us are engaged in a project of decolonization or collective liberation. And so it is important to see Kashmir as a place where that can maybe tell us something about what this means and what it means when a people have not been able to self-determine. Because much of the world is actually going in that direction, right? So it's not the future possibility of what Kashmir may or may not be that is the issue. The issue is that we are already in that hell, and what are we doing about it? And yeah, I mean, I guess that's how I would like to perhaps respond to that.
Awesome. Last question. Name three books that you think people should read about I mean that's not gonna be about Kashmir, but why not?
Okay, three books. I would recommend my colleague Atarzia's book on resisting disappearance. And it basically looks at women whose family members were disappeared and how they kind of negotiate that. Um, Gosh, two others that I would read. Oh, I have one next to me. My colleague Nishant Upadhyay, they wrote a book called Indians on Indian Land. And this book is so important for all of your listeners, because I know many of them are people of South Asian descent across the diasporas. And I think it really, really calls us to think about what it means to be a settler on these lands, but also what role does caste hierarchies and these kind of larger legacies of imperialism and colonialism play in terms of how diasporas are enacted or formed. So yeah, I'm sorry I can't think of a third, but those are two right off
That's
the top of my
that's
head.
fine. We'll say your book.
Yes, and the third can be colonizing Kashmir, sure.
Awesome. This was really lovely. Thank you so much. Anything else you want to add before we say goodbye?
I was gonna say that if I told you about this tourism thing, so the next time you post that tourism picture from Kashmir that says visit Kashmir, are you gonna incorporate
Yes.
analysis of how problematic that
I'm
is?
just gonna I'm just gonna take it down.
You're
I
just gonna
thought,
take it down.
yeah, I'm just gonna take it
Okay.
down. There's no way. Yeah, I'm gonna take it down.
Okay.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'll just release the audio hopefully next week and we're
Awesome.
good to
Thank
go.
you. Okay,
Thank you
great.
so much.
All right. Take care.
Have a good day.